Flight 401.
Around 8:30 p.m. on December 29, 1972, passengers inside of JFK International...
You know, I will say it's crazy. Some of these stories, I mean, it's cool because it's history, but it's like so old, you know? It's like so old. 1972. What is that, 100 years ago? I don't even know, man.
Airport in Queens, New York, heard over the intercom
Feels like 100 years
Eastern
ago.
Airlines Flight 401 to Miami was now boarding. About 30 minutes later, all 176 passengers, which included the 13 crew members, had made it on board, and then at that
look
point,
at those
the 13
seats.
crew members began making their final preparations for takeoff. Flight 401 was a very expensive and recently introduced model of plane by Eastern Airlines called the Lockheed L-1011.
That's a big plane.
And it was both unbelievably technologically advanced and unbelievably enormous. It sat up to 400 passengers,
wow.
which meant instead of having 4 seats to a row like you would expect inside of a passenger jet, the L-1011s had 8 seats per row, and they had 2 levels. There was the main level, which was the main cabin where all the passengers were, and then there was a second level, a lower level, that was only accessible via
There's 2
small
levels?
elevators that could barely fit one person inside.
You got an elevator and a plane in the 1970s. Matter of respect to that. Real pilot, I know, right? Park. Oh my gosh. Dude, those seats. Dude, an elevator? Bro, what is that? Like ice cream freezers? Hey, what's going on? Like the thing with the brown doors? I don't know. Wait. Oh. Ovens. Refrigerator. Maybe if I was smart I could read. Service cart storage. Oh, okay. They're service carts. Gotcha.
Side of them in the back of the aircraft, and down on this...
This video is 42 minutes long. Just put the toilets up there, right? I should not have clicked on this, man.
Lower level was a full-size kitchen which had ovens and refrigerators,
This man's
and
gonna be so
also at
mad.
the back of this lower level was a lounge area for flight staff. The pilot that night was Bob Loft, who was a strikingly handsome...
Bob. Who? I don't even have my thing up, bro. I know, man. But hey, at least we're chilling. Where'd my phone go?
Some 55-year-old man with over 30,000 hours of flying experience, which for reference is a ton of flying
I've seen people do it before.
Captain Bob was known as a perfectionist who exuded confidence and who was cool under pressure. After Bob had boarded the aircraft, he had made his way right into the cockpit, which is the very front of the plane where the pilots fly the plane, and he had sat down in the customary captain's seat, which
Look at
was
those
the front
seats.
left seat. And then after he had sat down, his 10 years younger first officer or co-pilot, a man named Bert Stockstill, had joined him in the cockpit and sat down
Imagine
in
being
the
named
customary
Bert.
co-pilot seat, which was directly to the
Bert.
right of Captain Bob.
Hey, Bert.
And so after the pilot and co-pilot were both seated, the remaining 2 members of that night's cockpit crew came into the cockpit. Now, normally in most passenger jets, there were only 2 seats in the cockpit, but because L-1011 planes were so massive...
No, seriously though. Like, who came up with the name cockpit? Think about that.
There were 4 seats in the cockpit. And so one of the last 2 men who joined the cockpit was 51-year-old Don Repo, who was the flight's engineer.
Who came up with that name,
Despite him being
man?
this big, strong ox of a man,
That's pretty weird.
he was actually known as being fairly soft-spoken and very approachable. So Don came into the cockpit, he said hello, and then he sat down in the seat right behind the co-pilot.
You guys are crazy.
And then a few seconds after Don, the last man came into the cockpit. It was 47-year-old Angelo Donadeo. Around 9:10 p.m., all pre-flight checks had been completed, all passengers were seated, as was the crew, and so Captain Bob began taxiing over to the runway.
Yeah,
For the
really
next
is.
2 hours, this flight was completely normal. In fact, it was so normal that one of the passengers named Jerry Escow actually wrote a letter while he was on the plane telling Eastern Airlines how great their airline was and how smooth this flight was. His plan was, once they landed, to mail this letter to Eastern Airlines. But at 11:32 p.m., so 2 hours and 12 minutes after takeoff, this flight would go from being very routine and normal to being anything but. At 11:32 p.m.,
bro, that bass drop, you know something's about to happen.
Captain Bob began his approach to Miami International Airport.
100%.
But when he lowered the plane's landing gear, his co-pilot Bert noticed they had a problem. L-1011 jets, like 401, have 3 pieces of landing gear. They have wheels that come down under the left wing, they have wheels that come down under the right wing, and they have wheels that pop out of the nose of the plane. And each of these pieces of landing gear has a corresponding little light bulb, a green light bulb, inside the cockpit. That once that piece of landing gear comes down and locks in place and is ready to be landed
There's sound
on,
effects,
its
man.
green light will go on inside of the cockpit. But when Captain Bob lowered their landing gear, his co-pilot, Bert, noticed only 2 of the lights came on. The one that did not light up was the nose landing gear. Now, Captain Bob and the other men in the cockpit, when they saw this issue, they immediately assumed it had to be the light bulb itself that was faulty, not the actual nose landing gear, because this plane was brand new, it had been checked before they left, so the likelihood of the nose landing gear being faulty was incredibly slim.
Ladies and gents, that's what we call a Monday-Friday plane. Somebody finished that plane up on a Friday, came back to work on a Monday. Yeah, it's no big deal. Sorry, man, you're crazy.
And so Captain Bob, while maintaining his approach towards Miami International, he retracted the landing gear, and then once it had come back into the plane, he just lowered it again, thinking this time all 3 lights would come on. But once again, once the landing gear was deployed the second time, still the nose landing gear light did not come on.
Dang, bro.
And so frustrated, Captain Bob hopped on
That's
the
a big
radio
plane, too.
and contacted Miami Air Traffic Control and told them that he could not confirm his landing gear was actually safe to land on.
Sounds like
and
they
so
broke
they would
a
have to
rubber
circle
band.
around for a bit in the sky and get it figured out. And so Miami Air Traffic Control acknowledged what Captain Bob said and then directed Captain Bob to fly out over the nearby Everglades, which is a massive wetlands area in Florida, and to stay out over the Everglades away from other traffic until they fixed the problem. And
Man told him to go, but yeah, just go over the Everglades. There's only alligators and probably some snakes and some other stuff. Like, no big deal. You know, if you crash or land or whatever, like, I'm sure you'll figure it out. You'll be okay. That's kind of crazy. I don't think a pill quits. Very much. Nah, bro. Man, that's crazy.
And so once Flight 401 was out over the Everglades flying in a circular pattern, Captain Bob and his co-pilot set the plane to autopilot so that it would maintain a constant altitude of 2,000 feet and a constant speed of 200 miles per hour. And so once the plane was all set, Captain Bob and his co-pilot Bert began fiddling with this front nose gear indicator light bulb, which they were convinced was faulty.
Could you imagine? Dude, my headphone cable. I need to get wireless headphones. Like, hey, Bob, don't think this light here is working here, bud. Yeah, just give it a few more bangs. Dude, I'm gonna wake up my wife. Hanging on the table like that.
And so they started by pressing on the light, and when that didn't work, they began twisting it. And when that didn't work, they actually pulled the light bulb off the
I know,
panel
right?
and kind of blew the dirt and grime off.
Bro, they are really convinced this light bulb is out. See, okay. No offense to the boomer generation, but in our generation, like, I feel like seeing a light not coming on was something like that. I feel like our generation, the first reaction would be like, okay, maybe the light bulb's out, but if it doesn't come on the second time, something is wrong. These guys are straight up like pulling the whole button off. Like, yeah, it's definitely the light bulb. We gotta fix it. No. Your wheels aren't coming out, bros. You better figure it out. Grab it. Pop it. Pull it. Twist it. Y'all remember that game?
Off of it, and then they jammed it back into the panel.
I'll
But
jam
as
it
soon
in
as
there.
they did, not only did it not go back on, but they realized they had put it in sideways, and so they couldn't actually get it out again.
Y'all just straight dumb. Y'all shouldn't be flying that plane. Captain. He sits in the cup. Oh my gosh. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Dude, they're screwing themselves over, man.
And so now they're thinking, this light's not going to go on at all.
I'm just very curious to see how this relates to ghosts.
We need to find another way to make sure the nose landing gear has come down. And so Captain Bob at this point is totally frustrated, and so he turns around and he looks at Don Repo, the flight engineer who's sitting right behind the co-pilot.
Nah, bro.
And he tells Don to go down into the hellhole and directly inspect the front landing gear himself. So
Oh
the
my
hellhole
goodness.
is a space right below the cockpit, and the way you get to it is through a trap door in the floor in the center of the cockpit. And then once down in the hellhole,
don't have to,
there is this
Don.
window that looks straight towards the front of the aircraft, where you could look out and actually see the front landing gear, and you could make sure it was down or
Is that a real photo? Taken at the later date. Wow. That's kind of crazy.
not. And so Don Repo, he gets out of his seat and he opens up the hellhole trap door and he makes his way down below. Meanwhile, 2,000 feet below Flight 401, a 43-year-old man named Robert Marquise, along with a friend of his, were looking for frogs in
Robert Marquise. Man, as white as can be. Last name's Marquise. What? Love to plot twist to right? Dude, I don't know, man. I'm interested.
the Everglades riding around on Robert's airboat. An airboat is a flat-bottom boat with this huge fan on the back of it that propels it forward. It's popular in the Everglades because the water depth is so shallow. At points in the Everglades, the water's only a couple of inches deep. And so all around these two guys, it is totally pitch black out. There are no buildings or people for miles and
it's
miles
dark.
and miles. They're only light source
Forgot it was
is Robert's
nighttime.
headlamp.
Oh.
And so at some point, Robert turns
Screen. Sorry. You guys could still hear him.
off the airboat, and he and his friend are just standing in the middle of it, kind of scanning around on either side, and all around them they can hear the sound of alligators growling and snakes and frogs moving about the tall grass. And as they're just kind of silently looking around them, out of the corner of Robert's eye, he sees something. And so he looks up right as he sees this huge orange and yellow flash that kind of came out of the ground roughly 5 miles away from where they were.
Wait, what happened?
Basically, as soon as Robert saw it, this flash dissipated and it was just totally gone. And so he turned to his friend who had not seen this flash, and Robert said, "Hey, let's go investigate. Let's see what that was." And so Robert fired up his boat again and he began flying across the Everglades,
are the guys in the boat.
straight in the direction of where he saw this flash. And after 15 minutes of cruising at 40 miles per
Is it the
hour
plane?
across this dark expanse, they reached the area where this flash had been, and Robert and his friend, they just could not believe what they were looking at. About 20 minutes earlier, back up inside of Flight 40.
What's up, Eminem? Why does this guy look camera payback sound? I don't know. Man. Yeah, thanks for stopping by, dude. Appreciate you.
When
Appreciate
Captain
you.
Bob turned around
All
in
right.
his seat to tell the flight engineer, Don Repo, to go down into the hellhole, it's believed that Captain Bob nudged the steering wheel with his leg. And this little nudge was enough to disengage the plane's autopilot, which sent the plane into a gradual descent.
Yo, these people, everything they're saying, they should not have been pilots of this plane. Just saying. Like, it seems like they have no idea what they're doing.
But nobody noticed. Because, one, it was totally pitch black outside. The Everglades below them, there's no lights, there's nothing, and there was no moon that
would
night.
never.
And so when they're looking out the
Jesus
window,
would
there would have
never.
been no visual cues that they were going down, up, or anything. It just would have looked like a total void outside. And two, the descent they were now suddenly in was so gradual, it would not have felt like they were tumbling out of the sky.
Yeah.
It would have felt like they were just cruising as expected.
Mm-hmm.
And three, all of the men in the cockpit were completely fixated on this light bulb problem.
Y'all need to forget about that light bulb. But to be fair, that's like me when something's wrong with the stream. Like, dude, I gotta fix this. Can we just make the point there's no way the autopilot could have turned off on the audios? Yeah. I mean, keep it. This is the 1970s, so if they couldn't feel the gravity off descent, they were probably, man. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe they, dude, it's 100% a Monday Friday plane, and that's what they call cars. I mean, call it a lemon. So I think they have a lemon of an airplane here.
In fact, they were so fixated that when an alarm went off inside of the cockpit, telling them they had
Bro, was that a slot machine? Wait, can we
this light bulb problem. In fact, they were so fixated that when an alarm went off inside of the cockpit, telling them,
Bro, it sounds like they just won the jackpot. You can tell just air. Yeah. I don't know, man. Something's going on here.
they had dipped below
Coach
their intended
Bamper, be
altitude
serious.
of 2,000 feet. They were now going down. Nobody noticed. Although, to their credit, this alarm only sounded once, and it wasn't that loud. And so not long after Don Repo had gone down into
Somebody
the
messed
hellhole,
up
the
building this plane.
crashed into the Everglades. No one on board Flight 401, from the cockpit crew to the passengers to the other flight staff, had any idea they were in an emergency until they hit the ground. And when they hit the ground, the plane exploded, and that was what Robert Marquis saw when he looked up and saw that yellow and orange flash. And so Robert and his friend, they speed over to the crash site, and when they get there, they are the first ones there. And even though they're looking out and they can hear the sound of all these people screaming and crying and moaning, they can't see anything because the fire from this huge explosion was already out because the swampy wetland.
Freaking Bob. Captain Bob. Dude, that's awful. It's an alarm for the descent, but really, that's crazy, dude. That's all right, man. I know, dude. Yeah, where's Michael and Jesus at in Ibanez? Dude, what?
Had pretty much immediately extinguished it. And even though the plane had crashed into the ground at over 200 miles per hour, it had not struck the ground at a very steep angle, because basically the plane was in this gradual descent pattern
Yeah.
and just kind of coasted until
Right, that's
it hit the
the
ground.
artist.
And so that, combined with the soft, muddy ground of the Everglades, meant that the impact of the plane hitting the ground was not nearly as violent as other plane crashes were. And that ultimately saved lives. In
Probably.
fact, dozens of passengers survived the initial impact with the ground.
Well, that's
But
good.
many of them were left with these horrible injuries, or they were trapped within the wreckage, or both. When Robert and his friend arrived at the edge of the crash scene,
my gosh,
Robert
that's
lifted up
horrible.
his headlamp and began to scan, and he saw all these body parts sticking out of the ground, and then his light rested on the first survivor he saw.
No.
And it was this man whose clothes had been completely burned off from the explosion. All he had on was just a little bit of his socks on both ankles. And this man was still strapped into the seat that he had been on the plane, and when the plane had broken up, his seat had fallen forward into the mud, pinning this man's upper body and most of his face under several inches of water. And so as Robert had scanned over with his light had hit this man's face, and he had looked up and pleaded with Robert and his friend to come get him before he drowned.
Oh
And so
my
Robert and his
goodness.
friends, they jumped off their boat and ran over to this guy and pulled the chair up and out of the water,
Nice sound
saving
effects.
this guy's life. But as soon as he was up and out of the water, Robert and his friend began hearing more calls from other people in the darkness screaming for help. Robert and his friend would do their absolute best to save as many people
Oh
as
my
they possibly
goodness.
could, but there was just too many people who needed saving and not enough time. About 30 minutes after Robert and his friend had arrived at the scene, the Coast Guard showed up in helicopters,
Oh,
and
no,
they,
man.
along with Robert and his friend, would spend the entire night pulling as many people
Is that
to
a
safety
baby?
as they possibly could. By the time the sun came up on the following day, there were no other survivors left to save. All told, 99 people perished and 77 survived. Amongst
Wow.
the dead were Captain Bob Loft and his co-pilot Bert Stockstill and their flight engineer Don
Dude.
Repo, who had gone down into the hellhole.
Look, I'm sorry they lost their lives, but I don't know what these guys are thinking, man. Like, again, it's the 1970s. Accidents happen, but I don't know. You gotta ask yourself in this day and age, like, does that same scenario repeat itself? Or I don't know, man. I don't know. It's just crazy. I mean, it was a night, and it's just they were just trying to get that button to light up. I don't know.
Amongst these survivors was Angelo Donadeo, the
You hate
fourth
to hear
man
it.
in the cockpit, as well as Jerry Ascow, the man who ironically had written that letter to Eastern Airlines saying how wonderful that flight had been. A major investigation following the crash would confirm that the reason Flight 401 went down was because of a number of factors, most notably human error. The investigation would also confirm that the nose landing gear was
Human error,
working
Captain
perfectly
Bob.
fine. The light bulb not coming on was a result of the light bulb being burned out. Following the investigation,
Okay, hold on. I'm not a pilot or an air traffic control person, but couldn't, yeah, couldn't they call ATC, air traffic control, and be like, hey, our light's not on. Can you see if the front landing gear is down? Oh yeah, it's down. You're fine. Okay, thanks. I don't know, man.
Eastern Airlines would make every effort to compensate
Yeah.
both the survivors of the crash and also families of those who were
I
killed
would think
in the
so.
crash. Eastern Airlines would also make major changes to their training for their pilots and co-pilots and anybody that was ever going to be in the
Yeah,
cockpit
man.
to ensure this type of disaster never happened again. But this was not the end of the story for Flight 401.
I know. Dude, I
Almost
want to
3
finish
years
this, man.
after the crash,
Finish my
hundreds
keyboard
of
off.
Eastern Airline employees began to experience a terrifying phenomenon. Now, at first, many of these employees were going to their superiors and reporting what happened to them, but very early on, Eastern Airlines made it clear that they didn't want anybody to talk about this. Anytime an employee made one of these reports about this phenomenon, they were either sent to the psychiatrist or they were just fired. However, despite this
how you
intense
gonna fire
pressure from
somebody?
Eastern Airlines to their employees to be quiet about what was going on inside of their ranks,
I would make you one, man. If you weren't a few thousand miles away. Homemade lattes.
there were still some very brave employees who had firsthand experience with this terrifying phenomenon who still came forward and told their stories to the press and to journalists. They just did it
Let's finish this story.
anonymously. And so I'm going to tell you 2 of the most chilling accounts from those employees. Keep in mind, the names used in these stories have all been changed.
Okay. Not alone. Not alone.
In March of 1973, so 3 months after Flight 401 had crashed in the Everglades, an Eastern Airlines flight attendant named Ginny was assigned to a flight from New York to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Working with her on this flight was her very close friend and fellow flight attendant, a woman named Denise. Neither of these 2 women were on Flight 401 when it crashed. The plane these 2 women would be working on their flight to Florida was called number 318 by Eastern Airlines, and it was an L-1011, just like Flight 401 had been. In fact, plane number 318 actually had some original parts from Flight 401 on it, because it would turn out, after that huge investigation was done on the crash, the investigators discovered...
Did my man just say they reused parts from a plane that crashed?
Lots of parts from Flight 401 were still in pretty good shape. And so after rigorously testing them and ensuring they did really work, those parts were actually installed on other L-1011 jets in the Eastern Airline fleet. Now,
Nah, bro, burn that stuff, man. Get it out.
for the record, this was not considered an inappropriate
It's the
thing to do.
70s, dude.
These parts were extremely expensive, and they worked perfectly fine, and they were not involved in causing Flight 401 to crash. And so no one batted an eye when Eastern Airlines put these parts on their other planes. So Ginny and Denise, along with several other Eastern Airlines flight attendants, board plane number 318.
Bro, just sell it on eBay, man. Get rid of it.
And after takeoff, the flight attendants began going through the very long and drawn-out process of getting food and drink for the nearly 200 people on board the flight. And so the way the flight attendants divvied up the work is they would have some of the attendants on the main level of the plane in the cabin taking orders from all the passengers, and then the other flight attendants would be down on the lower level, the second level of the plane where the kitchen was, preparing all the food and drinks. So at some point during this process, Denise, who was up on the main level helping with taking orders, realized she didn't have anything to do. She had taken all the orders she could, and so she decided she would head down to the second level, to the kitchen, where her good friend Ginny was, to see if she could help her. But ironically, as Denise got in the elevator in the back of the plane and began...
Bro, that's about the smallest elevator I've ever seen.
Heading down...
What is going on with that picture? Does my man have a bandage? Yeah, it's a okay. I thought it was like his finger was like cut off like right here. But it's just like a bandage. or something else?
To the second level.
I don't know.
Ginny, who was on the second level, discovered she did not have anything to do. She'd already prepped her cart, and so she had gotten into the other elevator and began going up to the main level.
Oh, there's two
to
elevators?
see if Denise needed any help. And so the two women literally passed each other in their elevators, but didn't see each other. And so once Ginny arrived at the main level, the cabin level, she got off the elevator and she walked down the aisle and she began asking around to the other attendants if they knew where Denise was. And they would tell her, oh, she just left a minute ago to go down to see you. And so after a couple of minutes, Ginny would leave the main level and go back down the elevator to the lower level to find Denise.
Let me guess.
Now, to understand what happens
Vice
next,
versa?
you need to have a basic understanding of the layout of the second level. So
Okay.
when you come down on
Tell me.
either of those two elevators, when the doors
Tell me.
open, you'd be looking down a stretch of hallway, basically the length of the plane from the back towards the front. And when you stepped off the elevator, you'd be stepping into the middle of the kitchen. Now, the kitchen was very,
Okay.
very cramped, and on the left side was a row of ovens that were all stacked up against each other. And then on the other side, on the right side, was a row of cabinets and cupboards.
Refrigerators?
If you were to
Cabinets.
walk down the kitchen straight towards the front of the plane, you would eventually reach a wall that separated the kitchen to the lounge area, and there was a door slightly off to the right side on this wall that you could walk through to get into the lounge. So if you were standing in the kitchen and looking in the direction of this door, you wouldn't really be able to see into the lounge area because, again, the door was kind of off to the side. You would have to actually go over to the door and poke your head through to get a full unobstructed view of the lounge. And all the lounge was a couple of sofas and chairs kind of arranged in a circle. So Ginny
wish I
has
had a
gotten
chair like
back
that.
in the elevator, and she's made her way back downstairs to
Pretty
continue
sweet.
looking for Denise. She
Right?
gets down to the lower level, the doors open up, and she looks out into the kitchen, and Denise is not there. In fact, the kitchen is totally empty. And the door leading into the lounge area is shut, so she can't even see in part of the way into the lounge to see if anybody is in there. But the second Ginny stepped off the elevator into the kitchen, she immediately had this powerful sense that Denise was definitely down there somewhere on the second level with her.
Hi,
probably
Denise,
in the
where you at,
lounge
girl?
area that she couldn't see. And because Ginny felt so
What?
confident that Denise was down there, she actually didn't start by calling out for Denise or walking to the door, opening it up, and looking into the lounge to make sure Denise was there. Instead, Ginny just turned to the left and went to the ovens and began preparing food for the attendants upstairs. And as she's making these plates of food, Ginny would periodically look over at the closed door leading into the lounge, kind of expecting it to open up at any point and see Denise walk out. But after a couple of minutes, no one had opened the door from the lounge, and Ginny was thinking to herself, I'm making quite a bit of noise over here. If anybody was down here, wouldn't they come out of the lounge and just see who it was? And because Ginny, again, had this really intense feeling that she was not alone down there, she began to think, wait a minute, is Denise playing a practical joke on me? Is she hiding in the lounge? Or is she hiding in one of the cabinets on the right side here, and she's going to jump out and grab me? And so the second Ginny began thinking about that, she became really paranoid. And so as she's making this food, she's pretty much constantly looking over at the door or kind of scanning behind her, waiting for Denise to launch out and scare her. But again, after several more minutes, Ginny didn't see anybody come out of the lounge and none of the cabinet doors opened up. It was just her down there. However, the longer she stayed down there, the stronger that feeling got that someone was in the room with her. And so now she can't even make her food. She's completely turned around, just scanning all around the kitchen, really at this point hoping Denise jumps out to scare her. And when Denise didn't do that, Ginny just began walking over to the door that would lead into the lounge. And so when she reached the door, her heart was racing like mad. She reached down to the handle, she turned it, she pushed it open, and she poked her head in real quick. And there was no one in the lounge. But immediately, the second her head was in that room, that feeling that someone was down there with her spiked, and she got chills all over her body. And she ran into the back of the lounge and looked behind all of the chairs and sofas, praying at this point that Denise was going to be down there.
Why didn't she just go and look in the first place?
But after looking all over the back of the lounge, there was no one there. And so finally, Ginny turns around and she's totally racked with fear because now she's on the very far end of the lounge. There's no one in the lounge. She knows there's no one in the kitchen. And here she is still getting that sensation that she was not alone down there. But she has to go all the way back across the lounge through that door into the kitchen to get back to the elevator so she can escape. And so Ginny almost instinctively moved immediately to the left side of the lounge and put her back up against the wall to make sure no one could be behind her. And then she began slowly inching her way along the left wall towards the door that was now open that would lead back into the kitchen. And as she's slowly shimmying along, her view of the kitchen is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the whole time she's thinking, I'm going to see someone in the kitchen because this sensation that someone is down here with me is not going away. But when she finally gets to the door and crosses into the kitchen, there's still no one there. And so she makes a run at that point to the elevator. She starts hitting the button. And as she's hitting the button, she's turning around and she has that awful feeling that someone's right behind her. And then finally the car comes down. She hops inside the elevator. She shuts the doors. She hits the button and she begins going back up. When the elevator cart got back to the main level and the doors opened again, Ginny almost knocked over the flight attendant that was standing right outside of it, a woman named Mildred. And after Mildred and Ginny kind of regained their balance,
you know it's the 70s when there's a lady named Mildred.
Could see very clearly that Ginny looked horrible. She was totally pale. She was sweating. And so Mildred said, Ginny, are you okay? What's going on? And Ginny would just say, I don't know. I can't tell you what's going on. I don't know. But Mildred...
Guys, 10 times more words. Yeah. I do partially agree with that, but hey, I do the same. Maybe less words, but...
Mildred, instead of asking follow-up questions, just said, Ginny, you need to come with me. And so Ginny would follow Mildred, who led them back around behind the elevators to the space in the back of the plane, kind of out of view of the passengers. And there, Ginny would find Denise. And Denise looked pale as a ghost. She was sweating and looked totally shaken up. It would turn out when Ginny left the lower level for the first time to come up to the main level to look for Denise, and then learned that Denise was not up there, that Denise had actually gone down to look for Ginny. In those few minutes that Ginny was up on the main level before she went back down again to continue looking for Denise, Denise was on the lower level. And Denise would say when she got off the elevator into the kitchen, there was no one down there, but immediately she believed Ginny had to be down there because of the strong sense that she was not alone down there. However, when she opened up the door to look into the lounge, she didn't see anyone, and it totally spooked her. She shut the door, she ran back to the elevators, and
it's like the same thing happened to both of them.
As she was going up in her elevator car, who, once again, passed her in the other elevator car? Ginny. And so once again, the two women did not see each other. And so these two women, who had never experienced anything like this before in their lives, had nearly identical experiences, totally independent of each other, just a couple of minutes apart in the exact same space. It was just too many coincidences for them to totally write it off. And so that was a big reason why they felt like they had to come forward with their information.
Okay. Hold on. This is in the 1970s? How do we know this guy isn't making this stuff up? 50-ish years ago. And we know the stories of Jenny and Denise. I don't know. First class. It's crazy, Suey. It's crazy. All right, first class.
1 month later, plane number 318, the same plane that Ginny and Denise had had their frightening experiences on, was at Newark Liberty International Airport in New Jersey, undergoing pre-flight checks from its crew before its flight to Miami that morning. After most of the checks were done, the passengers were allowed to board the plane, and then after it seemed like most of the passengers had arrived and taken their seats,
Bro, I should
the
just make
senior
videos
flight
like this and
attendant,
make
whose
stuff
name
up.
was Sis, began counting
Sis?
the people on board the plane to make sure they had everyone. And after counting up and down the rows, she realized their head count was off by 1. They had one too many people. And so when Sis began recounting, she actually quickly identified the discrepancy. Sis was standing in first class in the aisle, and as she was counting down the left side of first class passengers, she noticed there was an Eastern Airlines captain seated in one of the seats. And so immediately Sis thought, oh, okay, I don't recognize this person, but since he's in uniform, he must be deadheading. Deadheading is a fairly common practice for airline employees where if they need to be on a particular flight but are not physically at the origin airport, they will just hop on another company flight that happens to be going to the airport they need to go to.
Yeah, I know, right?
Least in the 1970s, it was not uncommon for employees not necessarily to tell the flight staff until they were literally on the plane, because these employees would just check the manifest, see if there were openings, and then climb on board. And so Sis assumed that was exactly what this man had done, and that was why he was unaccounted for, and it was why they had this extra person. And so she just needed to get his name to account for him. And so Sis turned and took a couple of steps until she was right in front of this guy who was still just seated looking straight ahead.
I'll be honest, I'm kind of zoned out on this one.
If he was deadheading. But the captain just continued to stare straight ahead and didn't even seem to register that Sis was talking to him, despite the fact that Sis was right on top of him and speaking very, very clearly, and nobody else was talking. And so Sis, who was aware of the fact that this guy clearly should have heard her, just kind of waited for a second and then just asked again, hey, what's your name? I need to make sure that you are in fact deadheading. But again, this captain just sat there without moving and didn't remotely react to Sis. Now, by this point, another flight attendant named Diane had looked over and actually saw Sis having this strange interaction with this Eastern Airlines captain. And so Diane walked over and listened as Sis, for a third time, tried to get this guy's attention, but he still did nothing. And so Diane and Sis, they start looking at each other like, what do we do about this? And at some point, Sis just says, okay, I'm going to go tell the captain, he can deal with this. And so Diane stayed in the aisle next to this silent seated captain while Sis turned and walked towards the cockpit, and she told the captain, whose name was George. And so George, he leaves the cockpit with Sis by his side, and they start walking down the aisle back towards where this guy was and where Diane was. And by the time they get there, 6 other passengers kind of in the general vicinity had noticed something strange was going on. And so they were all kind of turned around in their seats, looking at this captain who was sitting there, and Diane and Sis and George kind of waiting to see what was going to happen. And so George and Sis, they walk right up alongside Diane and this seated silent captain, and George immediately crouched down to get a good look at this guy's face, because again, this captain is just looking straight ahead with a hat on, and so no one had really looked at him yet. And so George kneels down and he sees this guy's face for the first time, and he falls over and goes, "Oh my God, that's Bob Loft!" The same.
Nah, man. Nah. Bro, I got chills. It's a little cold in here, but dude, what? Ain't no way, bro.
Bob Loft, who had died on Flight 401, the captain of Flight 401. George had known Bob really well and knew exactly what Bob looked like. But before Bob, Sis, Diane, or the 6 other passengers that were all watching could do anything, the seated, silent captain that looked exactly like Bob Loft vanished into thin air right in front of all of them. And immediately, these 6 passengers on board the flight that saw this happen became hysterical. They could not understand what they had just seen. People were screaming and crying, and George, Diane, and Sis, they were very shaken at what they saw, but they knew they were in charge of this flight. And so they tried to calm down the passengers, but then very quickly, they organized a search of the plane, because they're telling themselves, no one can just disappear into thin air. This guy has to be somewhere on the plane. And so for over an hour, the passengers were told to stay in their seats and were told to stay calm while the flight crew searched every crevice, every nook.
I would be off that plane. See ya. I'm gone. Get me off that plane, bro. Get me out of there.
And cranny of this flight to
Nah,
see
man.
if they could find
Get me
this
out.
guy, but they never did. And so
I
after a
quit.
very
I'm
long
gonna go work
delay,
at McDonald's.
plane number 318, along with its very shaken up passengers and flight crew, eventually rumbled out onto the runway and took off. When they landed in Miami, the first thing George, Diane, and Sis all did is they went in and filed a report about what they had seen, about this vanishing person. But Eastern Airline didn't do anything about their reports. In fact, the logbook where these reports were kept was conspicuously missing a couple of weeks later when some other employees of the airline heard about this vanishing person and wanted to read the reports themselves. And when these employees went to their superiors and
that'd be
asked
funny.
if they could get this logbook, the answer from the top was George, Diane, and Sis never filed those reports. There was no vanishing person. This whole thing is a bunch of crap. But George, Diane, and Sis all said, we filed those reports, and apparently some other pilots within Eastern Airlines had actually seen the reports before the logbook went missing, and they would tell other people that what they read was terrifying. Over the next 2 years, there would be an astounding number of other totally unexplainable events that took place on other planes within Eastern Airlines fleet. However, the strange events only occurred on L-1011 jets that had parts on them from the crashed Flight 401.
And
Some
they
of
should
these
have got rid of
unexplained
that.
events included more sightings of the silent seated captain who looked just like Bob Loft. And in fact, one of those sightings was by an Eastern Airlines executive who, after seeing this captain vanish into thin air right in front of him, the executive freaked out and ran off the plane and demanded the plane be searched top to bottom. But like the last search, nothing was found. On another occasion, the catering company that loaded food directly into the second level of these L-1011s, basically right into the kitchen, one of their staff spotted a man wandering around the lower level that looked just like Don Repo, the flight engineer from the doomed Flight 401. And when this staff member spoke to this man who looked like Don Repo,
he vanished.
Don Repo turned towards him and then vanished into thin air. The catering company was so scared when this happened that they refused to go back into the plane, and it caused a massive delay. On another flight, on board plane number 318, the pilot and co-pilot began hearing banging coming from the hellhole, and when the pilot got up and opened up the hellhole and went down below and shined his light, he didn't see anything, but when he went to climb back up into the cockpit, he looked up, and standing in the cockpit was once again Don Repo.
I would quit that job so fast. Nah, bro. No. I don't do that stuff. Dude, look at that. Look at that pause. A really nice green screen. Yeah, it really does. Dude, what? Going down there and you come up.
Looking straight down at him, who then promptly vanished right in front of him. On another flight, a female passenger and coach, who had been quiet the entire flight, suddenly began screaming hysterically. And when they went up to her and asked her what was wrong, she was pointing at the seat next to her and said a man had suddenly appeared right next to her. He did not walk in, he just appeared next to her, and then when she began screaming, he vanished right in front of her. This woman was so upset that when they landed finally in Phoenix, Arizona, she had to be restrained in a straitjacket when they pulled her off the plane. But as terrifying as all of these events were, there was at least one instance where these apparitions appeared to be helpful to the people on the plane. One captain said he walked into the cockpit, and standing in there was flight engineer Don Repo, and Don promptly told the captain about a specific malfunction in one of the engines before Don vanished in front of this captain. Now,
bro, if I go to sleep tonight and these guys are popping up in my dreams, oh goodness. Some of these edits. Yeah, I know, Ryan. Dude, I keep landing on like some. I'm gonna be dreaming of these people tonight, bro.
Now, this captain was horrified at what he had just seen, but he did actually go down and have that engine looked at, and sure
What's up,
enough,
Bob?
the malfunction that Don Repo said it had. Then finally, in 1974, all of these strange events just came to an abrupt stop. Now, no one knows exactly why, but in 1974, Eastern Airlines, despite telling the world they didn't believe any of the reports of these strange happenings on their planes, despite that year, they went into every single one of their L-1011 jets, and they removed any parts that had been placed on them from the crashed Flight 401.
Oh, burn that
Despite the
stuff.
fact none of those
Burn it.
parts were faulty. They were
Burn it.
removing perfectly good
Get rid
parts,
of it.
and they never gave a reason. And after they did that, all the sightings just stopped.
Who would have known?
So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already,
Who would have thought? That's crazy. That's actually insane. That's crazy. Man. The first thing, it was I like that story. Maybe I'll chop this up to first reaction video on YouTube. I don't know. The first one was kind of, with Denise and Jenny. That was kind of, it could have happened, but nah, dude. Just seeing those people vanish, that's crazy. Sorry. My gosh, it's so late. It's like 4:33. I gotta go to sleep, man.